Under Manila's orange sky, Manny Pacquiao drove his car down the busy avenue after a long day of political commitments. The city lights began to illuminate as the sun set on the horizon, reflecting off the skyscrapers that dotted the urban landscape. Years had passed since his retirement from the ring, but his face was still instantly recognized by everyone in the Philippines. Today, as a public figure and successful businessman, Pacquiao carried a legacy that transcended sports, although boxing continued to run through his veins like the blood that pumps life to the heart. In his elegant office in Makati's financial center, framed photographs told the story of his greatest achievements: the belts, the national celebrations, the moments of glory that had defined not only his career but also helped shape Filipino national pride. Among the images, one in particular stood out: his toughest fight against Efren Dagohoy, a Filipino boxer who had spent most of his career training in Las Vegas. Dagohoy's speed and power had challenged Pacquiao like few others could. The rivalry between the two had dominated headlines for years, dividing fans and creating one of the greatest stories in modern boxing in the Philippines and international sports circles. While organizing some documents, Pacquiao received a message on his cell phone. It was from Bayani Reyes, a former trainer who had worked with several elite fighters, including his rival Dagohoy. The message was brief, but its content made Pacquiao stop and slowly sit down in his leather chair. Bayani rarely made contact, and never for trivial matters. Something in the formality of the words and the careful choice of the request to talk about a delicate matter made Pacquiao feel a weight in his stomach. He realized that, despite all the battles they had fought in the ring, he knew practically nothing about his former rival's current life. Finishing his commitments early, Pacquiao drove to a small cafe in the Malate district, where Bayani was waiting. The place was discreet, away from the flashes and media attention that normally followed the former champion. Sitting in a secluded corner with an already cold cup of coffee in front of him, the trainer looked much older than Pacquiao remembered. His hands, which had once wrapped the fists of great champions, now trembled slightly as he stirred the spoon in the dark beverage. His eyes, once always attentive to every movement in the ring, now carried a sadness that Pacquiao immediately recognized as the weight of carrying difficult news. The meeting was brief, but his words stayed with Pacquiao throughout the night that followed. Efren Dagohoy, the man who had been his greatest rival, who had challenged his supremacy in the rings and provoked some of the most memorable fights of his career, was living in deplorable conditions in a small apartment in the suburbs of Quezon City. After a series of failed investments in real estate ventures in the United States and problems with gambling in Las Vegas casinos, where he had lived after retirement, the former champion had lost virtually everything and returned to the Philippines to save what little he had left. But the worst wasn't his financial situation. Efren was fighting severe depression that had distanced him from everyone, including his family. Bayani had tried to help, but Dagohoy's wounded pride prevented him from accepting any support. The news hit Pacquiao like a blow he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, Pacquiao woke up with a restless mind, Bayani's words echoing in his thoughts. After breakfast with his family, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Without warning, without cameras, without advisors or security, Pacquiao drove alone to the address Bayani had given him in Quezon City. The contrast between the upscale neighborhoods where he lived and the simplicity of that region was stark. The worn buildings, narrow streets, and constant buzz of children playing and street vendors shouting their products created a familiar atmosphere for Pacquiao, reminding him of his own humble origins in General Santos City before fame and fortune. The building where Efren lived had no elevator, and Pacquiao slowly climbed the 5 floors, smelling food being prepared, mixed with the odor of mildew that permeated the peeling walls. Reaching the indicated apartment, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. He didn't know how he would be received, or even if Efren would agree to see him. After all, years of rivalry had created a barrier that few could overcome. When he finally gathered the courage and knocked on the worn door, the seconds of waiting seemed like an eternity. What would he say to a man who had once been his greatest adversary and who now faced the biggest fight of his life, not in the illuminated rings, but in the shadows of depression? The door opened slowly, revealing an almost unrecognizable version of Efren Dagohoy. The man who had once been the embodiment of strength and agility, whose defined muscles and confident posture had intimidated opponents around the world, now seemed a shadow of himself. Visibly thinner, with deep dark circles and unshaven, Efren stared at Pacquiao with a mixture of surprise and distrust. The apartment behind him was plunged into dimness, with closed curtains blocking the morning sunlight. In the corner of the small living room, a worn gym bag with the logo of his former gym in Las Vegas remained as a relic of better times. A pair of boxing gloves hung from an improvised hook on the wall. Not competition gloves, but old training gloves, with worn seams and cracked leather, as if they had been used daily, even after his professional career had ended. No words were exchanged in the first moments, only looks that carried the weight of a shared history, of epic battles fought under the lights of the world's greatest stadiums. Pacquiao hadn't prepared a speech, nor planned how that encounter would unfold. Following his instinct, he simply extended his hand, not as a formal gesture, but as an offer of peace, a silent recognition of respect that transcended old rivalries. To his surprise, after a moment of hesitation, Efren accepted the gesture, shaking his hand with a strength that seemed to be the only remnant of the fighter he once had been. The following minutes were filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by short phrases and superficial observations. Pacquiao noticed the yellowed newspaper clippings on the walls, recalling a friend's days of glory. Medals and trophies were piled in a corner, covered with a thin layer of dust, silent witnesses to a glorious past that cruelly contrasted with the somber present. On an improvised table made of crates, there was an old radio clock still set to Las Vegas time zone, as if a part of Efren still lived in that city that had been his home for so many years. Amid the disjointed conversation, Pacquiao noticed something that deeply disturbed him. On a small table, several medication bottles lined up like soldiers in formation, visible evidence of the invisible battle that Efren fought daily against the demons of depression consuming him from within. Seated in the small living room, with simple cups of coffee in their hands, the two ex-rivals began to navigate the delicate territory of shared memories. Pacquiao commented on the famous fight in Las Vegas, when Efren had surprised him with a left hook in the second round that almost ended his winning streak. That moment had been captured by photographers from around the world, Pacquiao staggering, momentarily vulnerable, before recovering with the resilience that had made him legendary. A slight shadow of pride passed over Efren's haggard face, a brief glimpse of the fierce competitor he once had been, as he added details of the strategy he had planned for months for that historic confrontation. Slowly, the initial tension began to dissipate, replaced by a strange familiarity that could only exist between two men who had tested each other's limits in the most brutal environment of the sport. Efren revealed how he had studied every movement of Pacquiao, how he had watched his videos repeatedly until he knew every pattern, every preference, every tick before an important blow. Pacquiao, in turn, confessed that he had never trained so intensely as for his confrontations with Efren, recognizing that the existence of such a talented rival had forced him to evolve as an athlete. It was strange, almost surreal, how two men who had dedicated years of their lives trying to overcome each other now shared these stories with a mixture of nostalgia and mutual respect. As the conversation flowed, Pacquiao began to notice small signs of Efren's current condition that went beyond his worn physical appearance. There were moments when his gaze was lost in emptiness, as if his mind traveled to distant and dark places. His hands, once firm and precise, now trembled slightly when holding the cup. Occasionally, he lost the thread of the conversation, needing a few seconds to reorient himself. But the most revealing was the silence that fell over him when the subject approached the present. A dense silence, loaded with unexpressed pain and poorly disguised shame. It was the silence of a man who had lost not only his fortune and fame, but also his purpose and identity. In a particularly honest moment, Efren opened a dusty box kept under the sofa. Inside, carefully preserved, were newspaper clippings, photographs, and memorabilia from his career. Among the items, a small, worn leather notebook caught Pacquiao's attention. As he leafed through it, he discovered it was a meticulous diary where Efren had recorded every detail of his preparation for his fights against Pacquiao. Diet, training routine, technical analyses, even personal thoughts and fears that he had never shared with anyone. Those yellowed pages revealed a completely new dimension of his rival, showing the depth of his dedication and the respect that, even in the most intense moments of rivalry, he had always nurtured for Pacquiao. As the day progressed, Pacquiao began to understand the magnitude of Efren's fall. It wasn't just about lost money or wasted opportunities. It was about a man who had defined his entire existence through his identity as a fighter, as a champion, as a warrior in the rings. When that identity disappeared, it took with it his sense of worth and purpose. The walls of the small apartment seemed to close in on him, creating a prison not only physical, but psychological. The depression that consumed him wasn't simply a medical condition to be treated with pills. It was the devastating result of a champion who didn't know how to exist in a world where he was no longer recognized as such. As the hours passed, the conversation between the two ex-fighters deepened, revealing layers of Efren's life that the press had never captured. In a low voice and occasionally interspersed with long pauses, he told how his downfall had begun long before his official retirement from the rings. While still fighting professionally, misguided investments in real estate ventures in Nevada and California had begun to drain his fortune. His years of training in Las Vegas had connected him with dishonest advisors, attracted by his wealth and financial naivety, who directed his money to schemes that promised extraordinary returns, but which turned out to be sophisticated traps that left him indebted and vulnerable. The situation worsened when Efren developed a dependency on painkillers after a serious shoulder injury during his penultimate professional bout. What began as medical treatment soon turned into an addiction that clouded his mind and drained even more of his financial resources. Following the dangerous path that many athletes had trodden before him, he began frequenting casinos in Las Vegas and Macau, convinced he could recover his losses with some successful bets. Each defeat at the gaming tables only pushed him deeper into the financial and emotional abyss, fueling a destructive cycle of despair and self-deprecation that seemed impossible to break. As Efren spoke, Pacquiao remained silent, absorbing every word with an empathy that surprised them both. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. The understanding of someone who had also faced temptations and challenges, although he had been fortunate enough to avoid the traps that had consumed his former rival. At one point, Efren revealed his greatest shame. He had distanced himself from his wife, Lourdes Case, and his two children, not by deliberate choice, but because the shame of his failure was so overwhelming that he couldn't bear their gaze. It had been almost 8 months since he had seen the children, who now lived with Lourdes, parents in a small town in Batangas province. The most painful confession, however, came when Efren described the endless nights when sleep wouldn't come, replaced by dark thoughts that haunted him like ghosts. In an almost inaudible voice, he admitted there had been moments when he had considered ending it all, when the idea of disappearing seemed the only way to escape the prison his life had become. He showed Pacquiao a half-written letter addressed to his children, explaining his choices and asking for forgiveness, a letter he had never found the courage to finish. It was at this moment, with silent tears streaming down the face marked by years of blows in the ring, that the true extent of Efren's depression was revealed in all its devastating rawness. The sun was already beginning to set when Efren finally asked Pacquiao why he had come. The question hung in the air for a few moments, loaded with genuine curiosity. Why would a busy man like Manny Pacquiao, with his political and business responsibilities, dedicate an entire day to visit a former rival fallen from grace? Pacquiao's answer was simple and direct. There was no elaborate strategy, no hidden motivation. He had come because, beyond the rivalry that had once separated them, there was a deep respect born in the trenches of the ring. He had come because, in a world where people are frequently discarded when they cease to be useful or relevant, he believed that no one should face their demons completely alone. Leaving Efren's apartment that night, Pacquiao drove in silence through Manila's illuminated streets, his mind processing everything he had witnessed. The shared stories, the painful confessions, and, above all, the image of a champion reduced to a shadow of himself weighed on his heart with an intensity he didn't expect to feel. Arriving home, he politely rejected the prepared dinner, retreating to his office where he remained for hours, contemplating not only Efren's situation, but the unpredictable circumstances of life that could elevate a man to the heights of glory only to later cast him into the depths of despair. The thin line that separated success from failure had never seemed so evident. In the days that followed, Pacquiao made discreet calls to mental health specialists, consulting them about the best approaches for cases of severe depression like the one Efren faced. Without revealing the identity of the friend in question, he absorbed advice from renowned psychiatrists and psychologists, understanding that recovery would not be a simple or quick process. Among these professionals was Dr. Renato Navarro, a respected psychiatrist who had treated several elite athletes and understood the unique pressures faced by public figures. In parallel, Pacquiao contacted Bayani, the former trainer who had alerted him about the situation, proposing an action plan that would start slowly, respecting Efren's time and space, but offering gradual structure and support that could help him rebuild his life step by step without ultimatums or excessive pressure. A week after his first visit, Pacquiao returned to Efren's apartment, this time bringing Dr. Navarro with him. The introduction was careful, presented not as a forced intervention, but as an opportunity for conversation with someone who understood the specific challenges of those who had lived under the spotlight. To Pacquiao's surprise, Efren didn't resist as expected, perhaps because the weight of carrying his demons alone had become unbearable, or perhaps because the simple act of Pacquiao returning when promised already represented an anchor of trust to which he could cling amid the emotional storm consuming him. The visits became regular, always discreet, and without publicity. Twice a week, Pacquiao reserved a few hours from his overloaded schedule to simply be present, sometimes talking about old times, sometimes watching a basketball game on Efren's small television, other times just sharing the silence that, with the passing of time, became increasingly comfortable between them. In parallel, Dr. Navarro conducted regular therapeutic sessions, adjusting medications when necessary, but focusing mainly on cognitive behavioral techniques that would allow Efren to rebuild his self-image beyond the fighter identity he had lost. The progress was slow, almost imperceptible on some days, but constant, like training for a big fight, where each small daily advance eventually adds up to a significant transformation. A month after the start of this monitoring, Pacquiao proposed something he knew was risky, but potentially transformative: a visit to the old gym where Efren had trained at the height of his career. Not to fight or train, but simply to reconnect with a part of his identity that despite subsequent problems, represented discipline, dedication, and excellence. The proposal was initially met with resistance, the fear of being seen as a fallen version of himself, of facing looks of pity or worse, indifference, was paralyzing, but Pacquiao persisted gently, ensuring they would go at a quiet time when the gym would be almost empty, and that he would be by his side throughout the visit. Eventually, with reluctance visible in every gesture, Efren agreed, taking a hesitant step toward the outside world he had avoided for so long. Chapter 6. Return to the ring. The visit to Ilord Boxing Gym, one of the most traditional boxing training centers in the Philippines, was carefully planned to occur in the early hours of the morning, when only the most dedicated athletes would be present. Crossing the doors of the gym for the first time in almost 3 years, Efren seemed physically smaller, as if trying to occupy the minimum space possible. His eyes, once always alert and challenging, now scanned the environment with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. The familiar smell of sweat, liniment, and leather brought back a flood of memories, some glorious, others painful, all intensely vivid. Pacquiao remained by his side, a silent but comforting presence, respecting the time Efren needed to process that symbolic return to the world he had once dominated. Rosario Sacdalan, the old gym owner who had accompanied the careers of dozens of Filipino champions, recognized Efren immediately. Without fanfare or excess formalities, he approached with the respect reserved for true warriors of the ring. His words were simple: "The gym has missed you, champion," but they carried a weight that seemed to momentarily alleviate the tension in Efren's shoulders. Some of the young fighters present looked curiously, few recognizing in the haggard figure the man whose photographs still adorned the walls of the establishment. Pacquiao observed how Efren gradually relaxed as he realized that he wasn't being judged or ridiculed, but received with the silent deference that the boxing community reserves for those who have already proven their worth in the rings. The visit that should have lasted only a few minutes extended for almost 2 hours. After the initial tension, Efren began to move through the space with increasing familiarity, occasionally stopping to observe the young fighters, sometimes offering a discreet tip when he noticed a technical error. At one point, without prior planning, he approached one of the punching bags. His handsmun, which still carried the hardened calluses of thousands of training rounds, touched the worn leather with an almost religious reverence. Then, to everyone's surprise, perhaps even his own, he executed a simple combination of blows. The movement was far from the technical perfection and speed that had made him famous, but there was in it a muscle memory that transcended the current state of his body and mind. That simple moment triggered a subtle but noticeable transformation. In the days that followed, Efren demonstrated a renewed interest in his appearance, shaving without anyone suggesting, organizing the apartment that had remained in disorder for months. The curtains, previously always closed, now occasionally opened, allowing natural light to invade the space that had become his refuge and prison. During his sessions with Dr. Navarro, he began to speak more openly about his feelings of failure and shame, not as desperate confessions, but as conscious acknowledgements of emotions that, although powerful, no longer needed to completely define his existence. Noticing this evolution, Pacquiao proposed something even more ambitious, a role as a volunteer assistant trainer in the youth boxing program he maintained in Quezon City, working with children and adolescents from underprivileged communities. The proposal was presented not as charity, but as a genuine opportunity for Efren to share his vast technical knowledge with the next generation of Filipino fighters. The suggestion was initially met with skepticism. Who would want to learn from a failure? But Pacquiao was persistent, arguing that Efren's experience, including his mistakes and falls, made him not less, but more valuable as a mentor for young people who needed to understand both the dangers and the glories of the path they chose to follow. Efren's first day as a volunteer assistant in the youth program was marked by almost paralyzing anxiety. Before even reaching the community center where the classes took place, he considered giving up at least 3 times, convinced it would be a disaster. The idea of facing curious looks, or worse, of having nothing valuable to offer, fed his deepest fears. Pacquiao, anticipating this reaction, picked him up personally, transforming the journey into an opportunity for casual conversations that gradually calmed his nerves. Upon arrival, Pacquiao introduced him simply as a friend who knows a lot about boxing, without mention of past titles or his history in the sport. This unpretentious introduction, free from the weight of grandiose expectations, allowed Efren to enter the role of instructor without the overwhelming pressure of living up to a legend. What began as a terrifying experience soon proved surprisingly therapeutic. Working with young people between 12 and 17 years old, many of whom had never heard of his past achievements, Efren rediscovered a part of himself that depression had buried deeply, his genuine passion for the art of boxing. Correcting postures, demonstrating basic defensive techniques, explaining the fundamentals of balance and timing, he gradually recovered a sense of purpose he had lost. The teenagers, initially hesitant with this quiet and somewhat awkward man, soon began to respond to his patient approach and the technical knowledge that naturally emerged when he spoke about the sport that had defined his life. In the weeks that followed, a routine began to establish itself. 3 times a week, Efren dedicated his afternoons to the youth program, assuming increasingly greater responsibilities as his confidence grew. In parallel, the sessions with Dr. Navarro continued, now focused not only on managing the symptoms of depression, but on rebuilding an identity that didn't depend exclusively on past glories or the expectations of others. At home, small changes reflected his internal evolution. Books on sports psychology began to appear on his table, gradual substitutes for the medications that, under medical supervision, began to be reduced. His diet, previously neglected and chaotic, became more structured, and occasional morning runs were added to his routine, reintroducing physical exercise as a tool for well-being, no longer as a professional obligation. 2 months passed in this new routine when, after weeks of emotional preparation and several encouraging conversations with Dr. Navarro, Efren finally gathered the courage to call Lourdes his ex-wife. The conversation was brief and initially uncomfortable, marked by silences loaded with unspoken words and wounds not yet completely resolved. However, it ended with a small but important agreement. He could visit the children the following Sunday, a supervised meeting of a few hours in the park near her parents' house. That simple prospect, the thought of seeing Maya and Luzon after so long, injected renewed energy into his recovery process. In the days leading up to the visit, he meticulously cleaned his apartment, bought new clothes, his first in over a year, and even sought advice from Pacquiao about appropriate gifts for the children, determined to appear not as the broken and desperate father he feared he had become, but as someone genuinely fighting to find his way back to the light. The meeting with the children was simultaneously painful and restorative. Maya, now 10 years old, initially reticent, observing him with eyes that seemed much older than her age. Luzon, only 6, more open in his joy to see his father, not yet fully aware of the complexities of the situation. Seated on a park bench, sharing ice creams rapidly melting under the Filipino sun, Efren listened about their lives, Maya's piano lessons, Luzon's new video game, the small victories and everyday challenges he had missed during his absence. He didn't attempt elaborate explanations or grandiose promises. Instead, he was simply present, truly present for the first time in years. When the moment of farewell came, sooner than he would have liked but exactly as agreed with Lourdes, Maya surprised him with a tight hug and whispered words that he carried with him as a talisman in the days that followed. "I'm glad you're better, Daddy." 6 months had passed since the day Pacquiao knocked on Efren's apartment door, and the transformation was visible to anyone who knew his story. The man who had once barely been able to get out of bed now woke before dawn, dedicating an hour for morning runs through the streets of Quezon City before preparing a simple but nutritious breakfast. His apartment, now clean and organized, displayed recent photographs with his children, who had begun to visit him fortnightly in a carefully negotiated arrangement with Lourdes. The medications, although still present, had been significantly reduced under medical supervision, and the sessions with Dr. Navarro continued, now focused not only on keeping depression under control, but on developing tools to face future challenges with renewed resilience. In the youth boxing program, Efren's presence had evolved from hesitant assistant to respected instructor, whose technical opinion was valued by both the young people and the other trainers. Gradually, some of the most dedicated adolescents began to discover who he really was, researching his name on the internet and finding videos of his historic fights. The knowledge about his glorious past spread among the young athletes. But, surprisingly, this didn't generate the shame that Efren so feared. Instead, his journey, both in the ring and outside it, began to inspire a different kind of respect, not based only on victories and titles, but on the courage to face even more formidable adversaries, failure, depression, and the arduous path back to dignity. During these months, Pacquiao had occasionally mentioned to Efren about Isabelo Araneta, a successful businessman and former boxing fan who was developing an initiative to assist athletes in the post-career transition. The project aimed to provide financial guidance, psychological support, and professional reintegration opportunities for sports people who frequently faced difficulties after leaving the spotlight. Initially, Efren showed little interest, still insecure about interacting with people outside his newly established safe circle. But as his confidence grew, so did his curiosity about this initiative that could have changed his own trajectory if it had existed years before. A particularly significant morning occurred when Efren received an unexpected invitation from Pacquiao to accompany him to a charity event in Manila, where Araneta would be one of the main speakers. It would be his first formal public appearance since the beginning of his recovery, a prospect simultaneously exciting and terrifying. The night of the event, wearing a borrowed suit that now fit him better thanks to months of renewed physical activity, Efren faced his fears and entered the hall alongside Pacquiao. There were looks of recognition, discreet whispers, some expressions of surprise, all the reactions he had feared. But there were also respectful handshakes, genuine questions about his work with the young boxers, and an acceptance that Moore, although it didn't completely erase his past, offered space for a different present and future. During this event, Efren finally met Isabelo Araneta in person. After a surprisingly pleasant conversation, about the challenges of post-career transition for elite athletes, Araneta made him a proposal that would have seemed impossible a few months earlier, a role as a consultant in his financial and emotional wellness program for professional athletes. The project, still in its initial phase, sought precisely what Efren had learned the hard way: how to navigate the financial, emotional, and psychological dangers that accompany sudden fame and fortune, and the equally challenging transition when the spotlights go out. The offer wasn't charity. Araneta made it clear that he valued precisely Efren's unique experience, including his mistakes and his recovery, as an invaluable educational tool for young athletes. On a clear Sunday morning in Manila, a few weeks after receiving this proposal, two men ran side by side through Rizal Park, their steps synchronized after months of this shared routine. One of them, Manny Pacquiao, recognized by practically everyone who passed, occasionally stopped for a smile or a brief wave. The other, Efren Dagohoy, received looks of recognition less frequently, but those who identified him now saw not only the fighter he had been, or the broken man who had almost lost himself, but someone who represented something equally valuable: the possibility of redemption, of finding purpose beyond past glories, of rebuilding a worthy life from the ashes of defeat. The friendship between the two ex-rivals, forged in the most unlikely circumstances, had become a silent symbol of how, even in the darkest moments, an extended hand can illuminate the path back to light.
Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next cases.